We're delighted to partner with Bronsbury Park, Central Square, and the Beth HaMidrash HaGadol from Leeds this evening at Southampton. What a coming together. Once again, welcome. But this is the first of a three-part series. Session one, Rabbi Aubrey Hirsch. Thank you very, very much.
Good evening, one and all. I hope those of you who are currently on can hear me. Yep, good, fine, excellent. So welcome to the first part of this journey that we're going to take through history for the curious. And I guess it's true to say of Maimonides, of the Rambam, that although he never graced the front cover of Time magazine and Andrew Lloyd Webber never made a musical about him, that he's probably, barring the 20th century, the most famous Jew in the last 2,500 years. And he would not only feature on a list of Jews being asked about famous Jews, but even non-Jews. And we will see when I share the screen to what degree the reach of Maimonides exists. Now, just to deal with names before we start, he is alternatively known either as Maimonides or Rambam. And the reasons are simply which language you choose to address him. Maimonides means the son of Maimon, in the same way as Nachmanides is the son of Nachman. And therefore, his father's name was Maimon. Maimonides keeps his own name out of it. Whereas the Rambam is a Hebrew acronym of 4 letters, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, and therefore his first name being Moshe. Now, I don't know if you've ever been or driven through the section of Rehavia and Shari Chesed in Jerusalem. I guess you haven't been doing this in the last 3 months, except for those who have joined from Israel. But that area has many of the medieval commentators, so from sort of the 11th to the 16th century. And you have the Rashbar, Shlomo ben Aderet in Barcelona, you have the Ramban, Nachmanides of Spain and then the land of Israel. But since you have both Nachmanides in Hebrew, which would be Ramban, and Maimonides Rambam, you can imagine everyone's post going awry and taxis being sent to the wrong addresses one after the other. And therefore they came up with a solution that Nachmanides gets his name in its full glory. He is called Ramban, and Maimonides is called Ben Maimon. So he does have a street named after him. Don't worry, it's just not on his name. Okay, I am going to share the screen. Host, oh, hang on, I'm gonna have to wait for Ellie to put me back in. Am I back in? I'll wait till that comes on. What I would mention is the years in which he lived are 1135 to 1204. So we're talking in the middle of the Middle Ages. You will have those dates appearing on your screen in a moment. So for those of you who, hang on, we'll go all the way to the top there. Right, so you have there life and times of the Rambam, Maimonides 1135 to 1204. Now, what you have over here is a series of stamps that have been issued by various countries around the world, none of whom you would think have an inherent connection to Maimonides. We're not talking about Spain or Egypt, but rather Chad, Uruguay, Sierra Leone, and they all have this turbaned image of Maimonides, of which there is a statue in his hometown of Cordoba in Spain. Whether it bears any resemblance to what he looked like is a moot point. It was first created in the 17th century, but either way, you can see the reach that Maimonides has. Now, he was born in Spain, towards the south of Spain. Cordoba, you see there, towards the south, just above Seville. But Spain would have been pretty unrecognizable in terms of its population, influence, and culture, because at the time it was a Muslim country. Aside from, as you can see in the picture there, the Kingdom of Aragon, where Barcelona is, most of Spain was in Muslim hands. And until the Christian reconquest started in 1240, culminating obviously in 1492, when the Jews were expelled, but until then, the Christians were not only a minority in the country, but geographically in a rather small location, and the Muslims dominated the country, which is one reason why Spain would be very different then than today. Secondly, it was a country which was probably 20% Jewish. Probably a fifth of the people living in Spain were Jews who'd been living there for a while. There was actually a strong Jewish community there in the 7th century. They were expelled at one stage, but Jews had actually welcomed the Muslims in when they had attacked through the south, through Gibraltar and Malaga in 711. And they were promoted under Muslim rule. They were diplomats, physicians, they could own land in much of Spain, and therefore life for them was pretty okay, I guess is the best way to put it. Life is never ideal under either rule, under Christian or Muslim rule, but if you had to take your pick between those two during the Middle Ages, I would definitely have gone for the Muslims, who were far more literate, far more tolerant, and therefore allowed the Jews to flourish much more. Maimonides, as we said, was born in 1135. He was educated by his father, who not only came from a rabbinic lineage, but also taught Maimonides astronomy, maths, and various other secular disciplines. At the time, the Muslims that ruled there were the Umayyads. There were two general groupings of Arab rulers, of Arab Muslim rulers. There were the Umayyads and the Almohads. The Umayyads were not particularly religious, which suited the Jews down to the ground. There is an expression in Yiddish which says that the best type of association to have had in the Middle Ages, when Jews were ruled by other countries, was to have what they called Freie Goyim and Frumme Yidden, that the Jews should be religious and the non-Jews should be laissez-faire, that you can do your own thing. The worst would be if it was the exact opposite. If it was Frumme Goyim, if the non-Jews suddenly became religiously fervent, as happened, for instance, during the Crusades, because that would be a disaster for the Jews. And that indeed is what happens in Spain. The Almohads take over the governing of Spain. It starts in 1142, but by 1148, by which time the Rambam is having his bar mitzvah, at that stage they are now taking over large areas, both administratively and militarily, and they give the Jews living there one of three choices. They could convert to Islam, they could leave, or they would be put to death. By the way, that's still one more than the Crusaders gave the Jews, where it was a choice of starkly taking conversion to Christianity or death. At least there was the option to go into exile. Having said that, leaving town in the 12th century was far from a picnic. You were exposed to dangers on the road, highwaymen, wild animals, and just the vagaries of travel itself. You had no real idea where you were going. You couldn't plan your itinerary on the internet. And that meant that if you were taking care of elderly parents or you had very young children, setting out on the road was almost a death sentence. And therefore, even though we talk about it as three options, for many, that option of exile didn't really exist. Nonetheless, in the particular case of Maimonides, his father, mother, himself and his brother, who was 6 years younger, David, left and wandered through Spain, especially the Sierra Nevada mountains, for the next 11 years until 1159. They would be wandering through Spain. By the way, it was at this stage that Maimonides authors his first work. If we want some form of appreciation for Maimonides, we have to understand that he combines together, firstly, scholarship, that we knew before, hopefully, this evening's talk, but scholarship that was created under extreme circumstances. Imagine being on the run. Imagine not knowing where you will be a week from now, a month from now, a refugee, but a refugee in the forests and in the mountains, and authoring a work on mathematics and astronomy. This is before he was 20 years old. And beyond his scholarship, there is his statesmanship. There are the sorrows that he would go through personally in life, all of which creates out of him a tremendous individual. It's not just the fact that he wrote works which are studied avidly to this day. It's the circumstances under which he wrote them and the way in which he took a public position for the people of whichever country he lived in. So therefore, if I go down by a page, you have here, this is actually taken from his halachic work, but it's based on the work that he created as a teenager. You see here the complex mathematics and astronomy that was required in order to intercalculate the Rosh Chodesh, the way the months of the Jewish calendar work. We operate on what's called neither the solar calendar, which is Christian, nor the lunar calendar, which is Muslim, but a luni-solar calendar, not because it's mad, but because it collects together both the moon and the sun. So this is a work that he created at that age. He, in 1159, will move to Morocco, and he will be there for the next 6 or 7 years. And while he is there, he will create his first major work, which is his commentary on the Mishnah. Now, how do we know about him? So if you have a look at this next slide here, you will see his signature. The bottom of that page says Moshe bar Maimun, Moses, the son of Maimon, Maimonides, Zatzal, which means that by that stage, by the time this letter was written, his father was no longer alive. Now, the interesting thing is that if you're reading it, you might ask yourselves, how come I actually can't make head or tail of what it says in the letter? I mean, it's Hebrew, isn't it? And the answer is no, it's Arabic. Maimonides wrote, as did most of the sages living under Muslim rule at the time, in what is called Judeo-Arabic, which means the letters that you're using are the letters of the alphabet, but the words that you're writing are in Arabic. And therefore, when you come across a verse which he quotes from the Chumash, from the Torah, you can make out the Hebrew. But at all other stages, you're left scratching your head because you actually can't read much of it. And this letter is one example of many that is extant in the Geniza collection in Cambridge, where they have hundreds of documents which have Maimonides' handwriting on. And just by way of contrast, Maimonides is very famous. Equally famous, so to speak, definitely to the Jewish people at that time, is Rashi. Rashi lives a little bit earlier, 1040 to 1105, a century earlier, but equally famous. We do not have one word written in Rashi's own handwriting, to the degree that we don't even know if Rashi had 2 daughters or 3 daughters, because history is vague when we don't have documentation. In the case of Maimonides, we have a treasure trove of documents written by him and about him, And therefore, we can put together a much larger picture than would ever be the case about most great people who lived during medieval times. And therefore, here you have an actual signature of his. Now, while Maimonides is in Morocco, these fanatic Muslims will unfortunately follow him into town or into country, I guess. And the Almohads will set up shop in Morocco and will bring, once again, the same type of choice upon the people. And a rabbi in Morocco will tell the people that they actually have to die rather than convert to Islam. Maimonides will take strong issue with this. Bearing in mind, at the time, he is in his mid to late 20s. He's not yet 30. But he has tremendous knowledge, erudition, scholarship, and he will write a letter called Igeret Hashmad, the first of a series of letters that he will write. And this one will prove conclusively that Islam is not idolatrous. Of course, we believe the religion to be false, but the dictates of Islam are monotheistic. Muhammad is a prophet, not a god or son of God, and therefore the religion in and of itself, according to Maimonides, is not idolatrous. The big difference being that Maimonides therefore advised people to temporarily convert to Islam to save their lives, which they would not have been able to do if it was Christianity that was at stake, no pun intended. But in the case of Islam, since they would be converting into a monotheistic faith, obviously they couldn't remain with it for the rest of their lives because it's an incorrect faith. But nevertheless, temporarily, in order to save one's life, one would be allowed to convert. He wrote this letter and spread it as far and wide as he could through Morocco. And he had to leave it anonymous, because if he puts his name to paper and the authorities find out, they will kill him, because he is encouraging sham conversions by the trainload. He just wants people to be able to move on to a life outside of Morocco as soon as they can. So he keeps it anonymous, but the erudition of the letter was such that it was unmistakably the work of a sage, and therefore it was accepted. And he therefore is saving the lives of many Jews in Morocco and putting his own life on the line. And this is one of the things that I say about him, is he isn't simply sitting in an ivory tower writing his PhD. He's writing while he's on the run, and he's writing even if his life is endangered in the process. A true statesman. He will, however, feel the heat. By 1165, it is impossible for him to remain in town any longer, and he leaves towards the land of Israel. But the land of Israel is not quite the populated place that we would encounter nowadays. He comes to Jerusalem, where there are not even 10 Jews living. In fact, Nachmanides, who would arrive a century later, would establish the Ramban synagogue, 2 pillars of which we have in the Old City, in the Jewish quarter of the Old City. Nachmanides' synagogue wasn't actually located there, but those 2 pillars were eventually moved there. So a century later, you can talk about 1 synagogue in Jerusalem. When Maimonides arrived, there was nothing there. And he felt incapable of living there because there was nobody to live with. He journeys temporarily, goes to Hebron for a couple of days, and pretty much it's the same situation there. It is only on the coast that there are some Jews, French refugees, who have set up shop, but he feels he cannot live there. And therefore, in that same year, his father is still with him, although his father will die while he is in the land of Israel. In that same year of 1165, he will travel south to Egypt, first to Alexandria and then to Cairo. Fustat, Cairo, same place nowadays two slightly different locations back then, but he will then spend the next 39 years of his life from 1165 till 1204 in Egypt. And he will encounter an unusual phenomenon, and that is the Karaites. Who are the Karaites? Literally, the word kara in Hebrew means verse. And these were a group of Jews who accepted only the written law. And even of that, they accepted the 5 books of Moses and the book of Joshua and some of the rest of the 24 books within the biblical canon. But they rejected the Talmud and all the writings of the sages that came after that, the Go'anim and Rashi, etc. And they flourished in certain places during the 11th and 12th centuries. And therefore, when Maimonides arrives in Cairo, 2/3 of the families there, out of 150 families living in Cairo, 2/3 are Karaites, and 1/3 are what I suppose we would call today Orthodox, what were referred to in those days as Rabbinites. Rabbinite Jews, they follow the rabbis, as opposed to those who only followed the literal text. Now, Maimonides describes the Karaites and says that, for instance, you can tell if a synagogue is a Karaite synagogue because there are no lights burning there during Shabbat. They take the verse towards the end of the book of Vayikra, which says you may not have you may not kindle a light during Shabbat. They take it to mean there cannot be a light burning at all, even if you pre-lit it. So never mind, they wouldn't have Shabbat candles. They wouldn't have any type of fire, and therefore no type of warm food whatsoever during Shabbat. And there are various other practices that they engaged in. Just by the way, this is, I guess, more for Southampton than for the other 3 participating synagogues. Lithuania was a place where there was a strong Karaite community, and to this day, halfway between Vilna and Kovna, there is a Karaite synagogue and a Karaite community, and God willing, when the trip happens, we will be visiting that Knessia, that synagogue. Either way, 2/3 of the inhabitants are Karaites. By the time Maimonides dies, he has created a rabbinite community almost across the whole of Egypt. Now, it's fascinating because the Rambam, Maimonides, is asked a number of questions about the Karaites, one of which is, are you allowed to circumcise their children on Shabbat? Bearing in mind that we're talking about, in halacha, an extreme situation. Either it is a biblical mitzvah to circumcise a child who's born through natural birth, not through cesarean, on a Shabbat, or it is an absolute biblical prohibition. So, for instance, if a non-Jew wanted their child circumcised or wanted to circumcise themselves on the Shabbat, a Jew would not be able to perform that circumcision of bloodletting and cutting the skin, etc., etc. And therefore, the Rambam is asked this question, which is a loaded question, because it means, how do we view the Karaites? Are they outside of the camp, or are they still within the circle? And they follow up the question, can we bury their dead in our cemetery, etc., etc. And he gives a very interesting answer. It says, it depends. If the Karaites conduct themselves as an entity to themselves, and they say, you know, live and let live. We Karaites believe in one thing, you Rabbinites believe in another, but no problem. We have no problem with coexistence. Then he says, you should circumcise their children, etc., etc. Remembering, they're all marrying Jews, and therefore they are considered fully fledged. If, however, they seek to undermine the teachings of the Talmud, of Shabbat, etc., etc., then they are excluding themselves. This is Maimonides' halachic take on the issue. Now, I give you this slightly lengthy introduction because we're now going to see something that although this is written slightly earlier, about a century before Maimonides arrives in Cairo, it nevertheless is pretty much a snapshot view of what was going on there. This is a ketubah, a marriage document, which is signed at the bottom by numerous rabbis. Some of those rabbis are Karaites, some of those rabbis are Rabbinites. The document is dated 1383, which means that its actual date is 1071, because Jews in Muslim countries did not date from the Christian period. They dated from the times of Alexander the Great, which was 311 years earlier, 312 years, and therefore this is a document that shows that never mind Rabbinites and Karaites would have attended the same wedding, they would have co-signed on a ketubah. This is a fascinating document. We haven't got time much for it because this is much more to do with the Geniza collection, but just there's one part of it which is relevant to us. It incorporates in the ketubah all the ways of life of the Rabbinites and the Karaites. So for instance, in the ketubah, it says that the guy who was a Rabbinite shouldn't expect any hot food over Shabbat. Forget the cholent or the chamin, there isn't going to be any, because you're marrying a Karaite woman who doesn't allow any flame to be kindled over Shabbat. So there's all sorts of clauses put in the ketubah. How long the marriage lasted, I don't know. What's even more interesting is that within the Geniza collection, we find that this Rabbinite guy, he was the son of the president of the community, he was actually engaged to another girl, a Rabbinite girl, and dumped her for this girl that he marries because she has more money. Of course, it's something that would never happen today, but back in the day, this is an example, so to speak, of living history. And if at some stage we have time to look at the Geniza or even go to the Geniza, it's something well worth seeing. Either way, the Rambam Maimonides is now in Cairo. He's there for the next 39 years. And initially what he is doing is he is writing and he is teaching. And he is being supported by his younger brother. His younger brother, David, 6 years younger than him, who is a merchant of precious gems. And therefore he has the ability to author his commentary of the Mishnah, which is the first of his three major works, written in Arabic. And he wrote that sometime between 1155 and 1165. So by the time he comes to Egypt, he's already written that by the time he is 30. He will then also be writing his next major work, which is the Mishnah Torah, his halachic codex. And you have to realize he is the first to codify all of halacha. He is, if you wanted prior to that to know the laws of Shabbat, you had very little option but to study the entirety of the Talmud, because the laws of Shabbat are scattered throughout the Talmud, not just in the tractate Shabbat. What Maimonides does is in 30 chapters, he coalesces all of the laws, and now you have them all in one handy location. The main difference between Maimonides' halachic work and the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, which would be authored in the 16th century and printed in 1569, so some 350 years later, the main difference between the two is that Maimonides will incorporate all laws, even those that are not relevant today. You may be aware, you're probably aware of the fact that there are 613 commandments in the Torah, of which only 295 apply today. So if you buy now, you get more than a 50% discount. I can't guarantee it staying for long, because as soon as Mashiach arrives, all 613 are coming back. So buy while it's cheap at a 53% discount. Either way, in the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, you only have those 295 laws, whereas Maimonides has the entirety of all 613, even those that are not practiced without a temple. So he is writing this halachic work, and he writes this one in Hebrew. Why? Because the language needs to be precise, and it is just precision in motion. It's a work of beauty. you don't normally think of volumes of law books as something that you would read on a Sunday afternoon. But Maimonides' writing is poetic, is perfect, is structured, it's beautiful. And even the order, I remember when I was in Hasmo in the sixth form many moons ago, and I was doing history A-level, and they took us to Oxford to see some of the Geniza collection. The majority of it is in Cambridge. And we saw there the laws of Birkat Hamazon, the laws of grace after meals. And it was written by Maimonides in his handwriting, and he'd made an amendment where it said Aleph, in other words, law number 1, he'd crossed out Aleph and written Bet, and where it said Bet, law number 2, he crossed that out and wrote Aleph, which means that the very order of the laws was highly important. The structure was important. And therefore he has to write in Hebrew. It's a concise language and a precise language. That's the second of his works. The third one will be the Guide to the Perplexed. That will be the last of his major works that he will write between 1185 and 1190. And that, once again, will be back in Judeo-Arabic. Now, he is supported by his brother, as I mentioned. Here we have on the next slide a letter written by his brother. Now, just very briefly, just to show you, the handwriting is pretty similar. Hold on to the image of this, we'll come back to it, but just go back to that a second. This is Maimonides' handwriting, this is David's handwriting. They're pretty similar. And this is, in all likelihood, the last letter that his brother ever wrote to him. Because in that letter, which is two-sided, you can only obviously see one side in this photo, he writes how he traveled south towards Sudan. And he traversed the desert and he got separated from the group he was with, but nevertheless managed to make it to town. And he has now booked passage on board a ship to travel towards India, because he was a trader. And that's it. Maimonides never hears from him again. He is presumed to have died at sea, and Maimonides is absolutely devastated by his passing. He writes in one letter that he remained indoors for a year over it. But beyond the devastation and the mourning is the fact that he now needs to take care of the needs of two families. Till now, he's been supported. Now, not only does he have to take care of his own family, but of his recently deceased brother's family. And therefore, he becomes, a physician to the Sultan. This is what propels him in that direction. We're not exactly sure what year this is. It's in the 1170s, probably the early 1170s. Maimonides has knowledge of medicine. In fact, he has written booklets on medicine, not halachic, not Jewish, but simply general advice about poisons and et cetera, and they've been translated actually into English not that long ago. And therefore he was knowledgeable of these areas, and he became a physician to the to Saladin and to the Sultan, the local Sultan in Cairo, who lived in the palace, which was Fustat and Cairo. Nowadays, as I said, they're all one place, but they used to be in two separate locations. He becomes his physician, and that is now how he makes a living. And it is from that he will provide for his family and for his brother's family. The tragic thing about this letter is that Rambam writes, I shed many tears over the last letter that my brother sent me. And here you have literally living history. You have in front of you something that the Rambam held and that speaks of a tragedy that his family went through. Now, in writing, in continuing to still author letters, responses to Jews across the world, he is being written to by Jews from all countries. One of the issues is that obviously his commentary on the Mishnah and eventually his Guide to the Perplexed will be inaccessible to Ashkenazi Jews. It's written in Arabic. So although the preponderance, the majority of Jews at that time are Sephardim, but there are still tens of thousands of Ashkenazim, the majority true are Sephardim. But there is a family living in Marseille, the Ibn Tibbon family, Shmuel Ibn Tibbon and his son Yehuda Ibn Tibbon, who will be translators of Maimonides' works to ensure that there is a broad audience that is able to access what he writes. And within his works, he will have the 13 principles of faith. We nowadays have them recorded in our Sidurim as 13 Ani Mamins, I believe. They are based on what Maimonides wrote. He wrote them twice, once in his commentary on the Mishnah and once on his halachic work. Once he describes it in the negative, what one cannot believe, and once in the positive. And he will make it clear that what we would nowadays call Orthodox Jews do not depend on observance, but actually on dogma, and therefore will take issue with what Mendelssohn will be writing in Berlin in the 18th century, that we are not a nation of dogma. Maimonides will see it very, very differently. He, at one stage, is asked for a visit by his translator, none other than Shmuel Ibn Tibbon, the person, the family who have done him a tremendous favor. They have provided his works in Hebrew for all Jews. And they write to him, or the Reb Shmuel writes to him and says, can he come and visit? And the Rambam says, you know, there's nothing more that I would like, but don't bother. Why? Because I have no time. I have no time in my life. And he writes a letter. This letter was written in 1199. So it was written 5 years before he died. And I'm going to share it with you, and I'll read through parts of it briefly. He says as follows: Lord God himself knows how I'm able to write you this letter. I've had to run away from people, isolating myself in a hidden place. Sometimes I've had to lean against the wall, and at others I've had to write lying down because I'm so ill and weak. But with respect to your wish to come and visit me here, I rejoice. More than you would be happy to see me, I would be happy to see you. But my advice is that you should not risk it. I will write the bottom line of this page. I will write you my daily schedule. I live in Fustat and the Sultan lives in Cairo. The distance between them is 1.5 miles. My duties to the Sultan are very heavy. I must see him every morning to check on his health. And he goes through the whole thing, how much time he spends. And therefore, halfway down that page, therefore, as a rule, I am in Cairo early each day. And even if nothing unusual happens, by the time I come back to Fustat, half the day is gone. Under no circumstances do I come earlier. And I'm ravenously hungry by then. When I come home, my foyer is always full of people, Jews and non-Jews, important people and not, judges and policemen, people who love me, people who hate me, a mixture of people, all who have been waiting for me to come home. I get off my donkey, wash my hands, and go out in the hall to see them. I apologize and ask that they should be so kind enough to give me a few minutes to eat, because this is the only meal that I take in 24 hours. Then I go out to heal them, write them prescriptions, instructions for treating their problems. Patients go in and out until nightfall, and sometimes I talk to them and prescribe for them, even while lying down on my back from exhaustion. And when night begins, I'm so weak I cannot even talk anymore. Because of all this, no Jew can come and speak with me in wisdom, in other words, in Torah, or have a private audience with me, because I have no time except on Shabbat. On Shabbat, the whole congregation, or at least the majority of it, comes to my house after morning services, and I instruct the members of the community as to what they should do during the entire week. We learn together in a week fashion until the afternoon. This is Maimonides' timetable. Imagine how much he could have written were he to have had the day to himself, were he to have been what we would consider a rabbi. But Maimonides was taken up with his duties, because he had to provide, and not just provide for his family, But once he became that physician, for all the people who came his way, Jews, non-Jews, young, old, people who love him and people who hate him. The greatness of this person emerges when you get some idea of this history. I'm not going to take you much longer, another 5 minutes, and then I'll be happy to take any questions. At this same time in Yemen, a Jew arose who said that he is the Messiah. And he was brought in front of the Sultan, and the Sultan said, "Prove to me that you are the Messiah." This is all in a letter that Maimonides will subsequently write. And this Jew said to the Sultan, "You can cut off my head and I will live." So they did, and he didn't. And that sort of pretty much brought an end to him. But at the same time, there was a lot of religious fervor in Yemen, and they imposed in Yemen the same rules that they had imposed in Morocco and in Spain. Conversion, exile, or death. And once again, Maimonides took up pen to paper and wrote Igeres Tamil, a long letter to the Jews of Yemen, proving to them that Islam is monotheistic and that they do not have to give up their lives. They can temporarily convert until the storm passes, which is indeed what happened. And in gratitude to Maimonides, the Jews of Yemen followed the opinion of Maimonides in halacha more than any other, more than the code of Jewish law per se. And even in their prayers, they would add his name. He wrote Responsa, he wrote other major letters, but those two are the main ones, the one in Morocco and the one to the Jews of Yemen. And now we come to the third work that he wrote, The Guide to the Perplexed, the one by which he is best known definitely in the non-Jewish world, but least known in the Orthodox Jewish world, meaning on his halachic work, there are over 1,000 commentaries and writings that have been authored over the last 700 years. On the Guide to the Perplexed, there are about a dozen. That gives you an idea, meaning you can't ever decide halacha, law, without knowing what Maimonides says. You won't always agree with him, but if you don't know Maimonides' opinion, you're a fool to decide Jewish law. Whereas in philosophy, the Guide to the Perplexed may have been very relevant at the time, but nowadays it has a level of importance, but incomparable to his halachic work, because history has a vote. It could have been authored by the same individual, but is seen in very different ways. Now, the Guide to the Perplexed, as you're probably aware, was not without controversy. People felt, in fact, we can actually stop the screen share here if you want, because I don't know if I can do that, or am I the only one who can do that? Don't know. No, we're now really into screen share. Okay, I'll carry on talking and we'll ignore this. Oh, hang on, if I go all the way up here, stop share, that will do it. Right, okay. It's not without controversy, his work, The Guide to the Perplexed, for various reasons. One is that, especially, it's 3 books, 3 parts, The Guide to the Perplexed. In book 2, he talks a lot about Aristotelian philosophy and aims to sort of bring the two together, even though he rejects the idea of there always having been a universe. He obviously talks about creation of the universe, but nevertheless, there are Aristotelian elements in there. Also, his belief system in Tchias HaMesim, in the resurrection of the dead, was questioned. There were various reasons why the Guide to the Perplexed was seen as a more controversial work. And therefore was not accepted. More than that, it was banned and would go through various iterations generally after Maimonides' lifetime. But this is also a well-known work of his, and nowadays it is often studied because it gives insights into mitzvot, the ta'amei ha-mitzvot. And interestingly, Milton, in Paradise Lost, doesn't actually quote Maimonides in The Guide to the Perplexed, but is basing himself on him when he talks about the fall of Adam. And rather than dealing with the fall in a Christian way, where there is a move from innocence to sin, the Jewish view of it is that passion overcame reason, which is very much a theme that Maimonides writes about in the Guide to the Perplexed. Now, he dies in 1204, and he is buried in Tiberias in Israel, even though he dies in Egypt. I am happy at this stage to take any questions. I see that there is something in the chat, but that could have been, yes, okay. What does the Rambam say about Bochum sitting and studying Torah all day? Okay, so if you look in the Mishnah Torah, in the halachic work, in the laws of Talmud Torah, in chapter 3, law 10, you will see that he says there that one may not study with the intention of being supported. But if you then look at law 11, you will see that he modifies his position. So Maimonides seems to not have been in favor of what we have nowadays as a structure, not so much the bochum, not so much the students, the unmarried students, but the married students studying Torah. Does not seem to have been in favor of it. And the Kesef Mishnah, who is the author of the Shulchan Aruch, brings both in his early work, in the Kesef Mishnah itself, which is a work that the author of the Code of Jewish Law wrote on Maimonides' magnum opus. He brings Maimonides' opinion, but in his Shulchan Aruch, in his Code of Jewish Law, he does not decide that way, which means in the last 500 years, this seems to be an opinion of the Rambam, of Maimonides, that has not been codified into Jewish law, but nevertheless, it does seem to be that Maimonides was much more in favor of it. Whether in the 19th century, due to the Haskalah, or the 20th century post-Holocaust, he would still have had the same opinion. Well, obviously we don't know, but nevertheless, he does seem to take a much dimmer view of the idea that a person should study and be supported. But as I say, look in the laws of Talmud Torah, chapter 3, law 10 and 11, and that will sort of give you a more complete picture of his view. Now, there was another question in the chat box. What would the Rambam say about families having to prove their Jewish practice in order for their children to attend a Jewish school? So we have to understand that back then, all Jews were observant not to a degree, but they were observant. It's true that the Karaites didn't keep many of the laws that the Rabbinites kept, but they, so to speak, fanatically kept all Karaite laws, which is why the Karaites continues, unlike many other branches of Judaism, like the Sadducees, who die out eventually, or the Essenes. The Karaites continue for centuries, and as I say, they're still around today in the 21st century. In fact, in the old city in Jerusalem, there's Rehov HaKra'im, Karaite street, and there is a Karaite synagogue there. And therefore, they were strongly observant. So there was really no such definition as a Jew who was not observant. That changes between around 1780 and 1910. Over a 130-year period, the Jewish people will incorporate Reform Judaism, Conservative Judaism, secular Judaism, secular Zionism. All of these movements will arise between 1780 and 1910. In 1780, the Jewish people were probably 95% observant. They might not have been knowledgeable, but they were 95% observant in 1780. By 1910, it's probably about 40%. So over half of the Jewish people defect from observant Judaism in that 130 years. So what would he have said about having to prove it? For him, it would have been an obvious thing. You know, you would have known that people were observant. So I'm not sure if that answers your question in current practice, but that would have been what he would have probably said on the matter. I read somewhere that Richard the Lionheart asked the Rambam to be a personal physician, but the Rambam didn't accept any truth in this. It's possible. Clearly, he was around at the time of Saladin and therefore of Richard the Lionheart. It's possible that this story happened. Clearly, for a Jew to live under Muslims rather than to live under Christians made more sense. And therefore, he would have made the right choice from that perspective. Although, interestingly, Saladin died a pauper. He was buried in a pauper's grave. But from a general perspective, living under Islam was an easier route for Jews, and that story could have taken place. Do we have any more questions? No, I've put everyone to sleep. That's great.
There's a hand up. Michael Teacher. You don't look like a Michael, but... And there are another couple of hands going up. Or Michael,
Okay.
you might... The Michael Teacher...
Unmute and we can hear the questions. Yes, sure.
No, you've answered my questions. I typed them in the chat as well. So thank you.
I wondered if, in addition to those ones in the chats, you had another question.
No, that was why I put my hand up. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Anybody else with a question there?
There are another two participants with... Well, hang on, let's... Probably... Paul Martin.
Okay.
Maimonides, you talked about his controversies.
Yeah.
He expressed himself very strongly, didn't he, in quite a lot of his writing, when he was very critical of other Jewish writers. Why did he express himself in a very powerful way rather than being conciliatory in some of his writing?
No, I'm not sure that I would say that. In other words, when we are, it depends in which works. If we are talking in his halachic work, then the criticism that is leveled at the halachic work is more the fact that he didn't leave what we would call in Hebrew Mari Makomot, in other words, the sources from which he's deriving law, but not that he is strongly opinionated in his halachic work. It is true that he puts down his 13 principles of faith very strongly, but in some of his letters, when he feels he needs to rule or he needs to tell people what they should and should not do, there he might use stronger language, but actually he's quite mild-mannered, and it's really much more his opponents who are writing very strongly about him. Now, he is criticized for certain ways that he defined for instance, the anthropomorphological ideas of God, God's hand, God's seeing, these things, and how he deals with that. Those perhaps created controversies in their own right. But the way he expressed himself generally was actually pretty mildly. Interestingly, on the page with Maimonides' halachic work is the Raavad. And the Raavad, who lived at the same time, but in Provence, in the south of France, where there was quite a Jewish community, he is quite critical of Maimonides at times, and he expresses himself quite strongly against Maimonides, but it's printed side by side with Maimonides.
I was thinking more like he strongly attacked anyone who would believe in astrology or signs of the zodiac and that kind of thing, whereas so a lot of people later on, particularly, have said that there is truth in quite a lot.
So even in the, so to speak, the question of what you might call philosophy, rational Judaism versus Kabbalah, it's never as simple as that. It's not a case by any means that Maimonides outlaws or invalidates Kabbalah. In fact, there are certain quotes in Maimonides' works which only appear in Kabbalistic writings. When he talks about anger, he quotes phrases which are not to be found in the Talmud, not to be found in the Midrash, but are to be found in Kabbalah. So it isn't a rejection. What he was concerned about was the too great an interest that people are placing in these things at the expense of philosophy and at the expense of rational Judaism. And hence, famously, Whereas Nachmanides says that the way we know God is through faith and through the experiential element. Maimonides says that the mitzvah to know God is by looking around at the physical and natural world and seeing God there. And that is a divergence. It's not a dichotomy, but it's a divergence between the rational and perhaps the more Kabbalistic approaches to Judaism, but it's not a rejection thereof.
Rabbi Hirsch, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you very, very much. I'm so sorry once again about the problems at the beginning. We don't know what happened, but remarkably, Rabbi Hirsch, in your fantastic style, you brought us all together. And this is really a moment in Jewish history of unity between different communities in various areas of London and Leeds. And I know there are people from America, Israel, and beyond who have joined us as well. Hopefully even more will be able to log on more easily next week. So Rabbi, could we just finish with a taster for the next session, which will take place, God willing, next Thursday at 8 o'clock, all being well?
Yes, so we are going to be talking about Donna Grazia. In a way, we will be talking about the conversos, the sometimes referred to as Marrano Jews, and the limited choices they had, and how they managed to bring a level of Judaism into their lives, even though the practice of Judaism was completely outlawed. Donna Grazia herself was born in Portugal to a family of Anusim, of conversos Jews, and yet that element of Judaism, of Jewish identity, was very strongly extant within her, and she would take it on her travels. Her travels were absolutely fascinating, where she went, who she met, and how she navigated not only the worlds of religion, of Christianity and Judaism, but the world of high finance, a woman widowed at a very young age, and ultimately settling in a country where she could embrace her Judaism completely openly in the Ottoman Empire. So I would definitely say worth tuning in for.